Clearly, we're all aware that we live in a time today of polarization that seems to be increasing from day to day, and the tensions that exist in our midst around that polarization. And so as we talk this morning, APU has deliberately staked out the messy middle. We've chosen to be a place where we engage different ideas. We don't assume that one idea holds total prominence over all others when it comes to matters of opinion. Instead, I like to say we've ferociously staked out this middle ground, because it isn't as if we're wishy-washy. It isn't as if we're blown by the winds of change. It's more that we want to engage in the dialogue that helps us to connect with other people, to understand and be understood. So in that light, I'm very pleased today that we are able to welcome Dr. John Inazu to our campus. Dr. Inazu is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. He has his BSc and JD from Duke and his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His scholarship focuses on First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, and the related issues of political and legal theory. He teaches courses on criminal law, law and religion, and the First Amendment. But his most recent book is why he's here today. Some of us read this book, Confident Pluralism. And in this book, he lays out a thesis of how we can engage with others in a way that is kind and civil and engaging. During his session this morning, he's going to be interviewed by Dr. Walsh, the Dean of our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. But at the conclusion of the interview, we will have an opportunity for questions to be posed to him. And as we have done in the past, we're going to be doing that electronically. And so during their talk, as an idea triggers for you, you can submit a question to askjohn@apu.edu. And make sure you spell it John. This is not for the president. This is for John Inazu. Send your questions, and we have a team of faculty here at the front table. Doug Hume from Political Science, Kirsten O from Practical Theology, Dan Palm from Political Science, and Joyce Gomez-Najarro from Teacher Education. And they're going to be gathering your thoughts and ideas into, especially if they cluster into theme questions, that can be posed to John for his response. So please be certain to start to send those in as they're talking so that they can begin to prepare those questions and ask them of him for the question and answer time. Will you now join me in welcoming Dr. John Inazu and Dr. Jennifer Walsh.
John, it's really wonderful to have you here. I think I'll prop this up here so it's nice in the camera shot. There's a shameless plug for your book. So I thought maybe in our conversation today, we could just start off with a big picture of what confident pluralism is. And as a political scientist, I love that in your introduction, you point out that really, in some ways, your book is a refutation of something that philosopher Rousseau said in The Social Contract 250 years ago, where he basically said, it's impossible for us to live with people who we think are damned. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but how would confident pluralism be a response to that 250 years later, knowing that some things are timeless, that we're still looking at trying to engage with people who are, and sometimes we view them on the wrong side of history. So give us a big picture here.
Great, thanks. And it's just a privilege to be here with all of you. Thank you for the invitation. I think I do want to answer that question. It's a great one, but if you allow me just a minute to reflect on what we just were part of this morning. I was thinking about this in the context, obviously, of Charlottesville and other commentary I've been reading. And without knowing any of you, I don't want to overly romanticize what this place is. I know that there's sin and brokenness and unmet expectations. But what you were able to do this morning was to name a purpose of your institution and a purpose that gives you the moral resources to respond with clarity to what's going on in our country. And you can't underestimate the significance of the capacity to name a purpose. A friend of mine who's on the UVA faculty, and I spent a year there on a sabbatical, so I was very familiar with the places and people involved. He had a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Ed just recently, and the piece was, after Charlottesville, don't look to universities for moral clarity. And I think he's right in many cases. And I think that means that many universities, like mine, need to be looking for partners elsewhere, churches, other institutions. And there are some universities in the country, and this is one of them, where you have a purpose you can name. And again, it's going to be messy, and not everyone's on the same page, but you have the opportunity to do so. And in this sort of national moment that's not going away anytime soon, those kinds of institutional voices are going to be important. So thanks for the work that you all are doing. I want to your question about the overview of the argument in this book, and it will tie in, I think, to what I was just talking about a second ago. The premise of the book starts with the fact that we have these deep and painful differences in our society. To the Rousseau point, they matter with eternal significance on many levels, and they're not going away. And so this is the fact of pluralism in our world. We can't pretend that all of our differences are good. They're there, and they're going to create challenges for us. And then so the question is, what do we do with those challenges? We can try to ignore them and go into our own echo chambers, but that's not really living together. That's really trying to coexist without any interaction. Or we can seek total control through manipulation or power or sometimes violence. Or we can figure out a way to live in spite of our differences. And that won't be easy, but that's the response of pluralism, or what I've called confident pluralism, that in the face of Rousseau's prediction says that can't be the answer. It can't be impossible because we've got to figure out a way to do this. And so I try to map out one possibility. I'm not the only one doing it, but trying to suggest what can our civic practices and our own internal posture be in our engagement with others, and then what are the institutional and legal structures that we have to have in our society to make that possible. And we're going to need both. We're going to need spoiler alert here, neither our civic practices nor our legal structures are very good right now, so we have a lot of work to do, but we're going to need both in order to make this possible.
Yeah, good. Well, in thinking about it, you're being a constitutional scholar, you lead with the Constitution as being a framework that really fosters at least some degree of unity, and you recognize that it's modest unity, that we're never going to have complete and total unity, and maybe that's not even something we want. But with the First Amendment and other protections we see in the Constitution, it does seem to be a safeguard for individual rights against perhaps encroaching government authority or some coercive elements in society. But you think that some of those protections now are less than what they used to be. So in particularly religious liberty, which is obviously something we all very, very much cherish here. So tell us a little bit about why you think that's the case, and if there's any hope for the future that you see when you look at the court and other developments in the system.
Right. I think one of the paradoxes with constitutional law is that you mentioned the idea of the modest unity. We have to have enough agreement that we need the protections mutually to disagree, right? Including protecting people who we don't like and who we think are being dangerous and perhaps even evil to an extent. They have to be protected too if they're playing by the same rules of the game. And that's hard. It's been in our Constitution. We've done it better and worse in history, but we also have to keep telling ourselves why it's important. So one of the most shocking statistics I read in the past year or so was a Pew report suggesting that 40% of millennials think that it is okay to ban under the law offensive speech that they don't like. That's for many of us who kind of grew up with a civics class that said something about the First Amendment, that's directly contrary to where we've come from and the lessons we learned pretty painfully in the 1920s and 30s about why free speech is important. And so we can't take for granted that each generation just knows the same intuitive lessons that we've learned, and we have to keep telling those stories. Same with religious liberty. We can't, especially with the changing demographics in this country, when you reach a tipping point where a non-trivial segment of your country rejects any kind of religious belief at all, then it's important to start asking the questions, well, what's in it for them? Why should they or why would they care for religious freedom? And then the challenges of that cultural question are complicated by the legal structure that's been in place for almost 30 years now at the Supreme Court's level of interpretation of the free exercise of religion, and it's not very good. It doesn't actually give very expansive protections in the ways that probably many Christians assume it does. And so there are real challenges there to what's the actual content of the modest unity that's going to hold us together.
And to go a little bit off script for just a moment, as you were talking, thinking about some of the conversations I had last November as people were wrestling with the decision of who to support for the office of president. And in talking with folks, it seemed to be that the courts were first and foremost in their mind because they were cognizant of the fact that presidents now have so much appointment power that can really shape our interpretation of the Constitution and religious liberty. Do you think that's perhaps an unfounded concern, or do we place too much emphasis on the courts for that? Is it really more important to develop a groundswell of support for religious liberty, perhaps within the populace itself, rather than just relying on jurists to protect our liberties in that regard?
I mean, I think it's probably both. I think structurally, we've ceded a lot of moral power to the Supreme Court on a whole range of issues, right? And some of those we like and some of those we don't, but the fact of the world is that institution has a lot of power to shape norms and craft what the law looks like. So I don't want to dismiss the significance of the court. I think the cultural question is an important one and also has to be tackled, but it has to be done in a way, let me put it this way, the only pragmatic and possible way ahead that I see for an argument for religious liberty that is going to have traction outside of rooms like this is one that is done in partnership with other faiths and with other people of all races and even at times when it makes sense to make those arguments on behalf of non-believers. So think about the role of atheists in society today and what kinds of legal protections do we want for them in places that still today are overwhelmingly Christian. So if you're an atheist parent and your atheist kid is going to public school in the South, what kind of legal protections do you want under the auspices of religious liberty for your kid? And until we as Christians can start recognizing the significance of the breadth of those arguments, a narrowly crafted argument for religious liberty is going to sound like special pleading for us and is not going to be a cultural winner.
Right. And you pointed out, too, that it's not just a matter of preserving individual rights, and we see sometimes in conversations with lawmakers here in California that there's, I think, a desire to put people back in private spheres that, you're fine to have your religious liberty as long as you do it in your own home, or maybe you're contained to your churches. But you were saying in your book that really it's more important to have a robust protection that extends to voluntary groups that are, in some cases, even subsidized by tax donations or nonprofit designations, but that perhaps we don't have the richness of protection right now that we should be. And I know that's a challenging argument, given that some of the groups that we see demonstrating, for example, UVA and places, are often sponsoring ideologies and beliefs that many people find hurtful and deeply offensive. So what's the role of these voluntary groups, and are there any limitations that you think we ought to consider when we're sponsoring them?
One of the challenges that makes voluntary groups so important is the practical reality of how commingled, both for governmental and sometimes theological reasons, we actually are in society today. So this space right here is regulated by a whole host of local, state, and federal laws, right? And so we think of this as maybe a private space and a private institution, but really, there's a fire code, and there's probably codes about what you can eat in here, and we could go on and on, right? There'd be hundreds of regulations, and so the regulatory state today is in our lives everywhere. It's impossible to avoid, and so are government dollars. And then on the other hand, for many of us, our faith intuitively and intrinsically is one that we want to share and be outward about, and this is something that's missing from the other side of understanding sometimes. There was a law that was proposed in Illinois within the last year that was offering protections to churches, but only if they open their doors only to their members, right? And you thought, well, that's actually not what a lot of churches want to do. They want to open their doors precisely to others to come into the church. Yeah. And so the theological impulse to share and expand your faith beyond just the closed doors of your own community and the governmental realities of where government dollars and government regulations are means that this is a really complicated space to be in.
Sure. And the public space is, as you pointed out, very complex, and you're going to have a cacophony of voices. And to lighten things up a little bit, I was reminded that in your book you talk about being a fan of the show Parks and Recreation. So I know many of you are also fans out here. And even though it's set in small town Indiana, I want to point out that it's filmed, at least the exterior shots, just down the street in Pasadena. So, you know, they can say it's Indiana, but we know the truth. But in that show, the comedic value shows up when they're having these town hall meetings and these public discussions about things that are obviously resonating with the voters, and whether it's banning small, this activity or big gulp drinks. There's people are very passionate about that. What role do you think those conversations have in promoting confident pluralism? Because sometimes we just end up fighting in those discussions, even if it's about silly things. So tell me a little bit about your thinking on that.
Yeah, in the public forum generally,
Yeah.
one of the biggest wins for me was when one of the actors read part of the book and wrote a little reflection on it. Not kind of a bit player in the show, but it was really nice of him to do, and I'm a huge fan of the show. And I think, actually, this isn't quite to your question, but just to pause and note the importance of humor and stories to what we do and how we engage with others, and to be able to, even in the midst of challenging conversations and when people critique us for who we are, they think we are, instead of just responding with an immediate retort, just sometimes to laugh or point out an irony or something like that. So, and I think Parks and Rec does that well. There are vignettes about local government practices, right? The smallest park in the state of Indiana, or the horse Little Sebastian, for some of you. Our kids love that song. They sing it all the time, almost ritualistically in our house. And I think these stories highlight the reality over silly issues that we don't actually get too energized about, but to point out that this is actually how local government works at its best, is to figure out how to come together and find common ground. And one of the places we do that is in what's technically called the public forum, the idea that the government locally and federally and otherwise provides spaces that are government-funded and government-managed spaces, but within those spaces, the whole idea is that citizens and their groups come together on their own terms to express themselves and to argue their own points in the manner in which they would like to do so. And it's a critical part of how our constitutional design is intended, that we allow these breathing spaces for people sometimes to come together and sometimes to remain apart. And so there are scenes in Parks and Rec where people are just kind of shouting at each other, but even the ability for people to do that in government spaces within the bounds of peaceability and stability and order, which are important and tricky, but we have to have those spaces, and increasingly we're losing them. And so I think part of what Parks and Rec is showing is reminding your average television viewer that there's an important civic component, that we're in it mutually with the people we elect to govern us. They have to provide the spaces, we have to use those spaces well, but we have to remember why they're there, and that part of having them there means a bit of risk and instability, that we're not always going to agree with each other, even with the ways in which we express ourselves.
Yeah. So in light of the events of the last couple of weeks, where we've had profound disagreements in the public square about ideas that relate to some of our deepest wounds as a nation, race relations and people feeling marginalized and out of power. How do we navigate that in a way that is constructive? I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of productivity in some cases to actually sit down and argue with someone who believes that there's a group of people that is less than. But do you find value in that? Do we use the public square in this discussion in a persuasive way? Is there opportunities to convince and persuade, or is it hopeless? What would you recommend?
The last few weeks have really complicated this question. I have a friend who, and we sometimes do public speaking together, and he would, until about 2 weeks ago, would say, let's just stipulate that we're not talking about the Klan. and that you can no longer do that, right?
No.
We're talking about the Klan, and we're talking about hate groups, and so what role do they have to play? So I'll start by saying I'm pretty close to a free speech absolutist, and that this, I think, recognizing the significance of allowing forms of speech, even those that we detest, even those that are going to cause psychological and emotional harm. That's a built-in trade-off of the First Amendment. It's been there for a long time. When we think about the kinds of speech we allow people to say, even though that speech that does harm other people, short of actual incitement to law-breaking, violent or not, that's the line that the courts have drawn. And I think that's the right line. I do think that some of these groups pose really particular questions, and I've been in conversations with other First Amendment folks about, even theoretically, what if we just said this particular group is in that category of a few other groups like Al-Qaeda, and we just don't allow them to exist in this country? That's happened in other countries. It's happened in Germany, and there we would have our own good historical reasons for thinking about that. Now, the immediate response is that's a slippery slope, right? Who else is going to be in that category? And it's not an insignificant question, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure the slippery slope necessarily happens. You can't functionally ban every hate group or even every racially oriented hate group, but it's possible that you could take out the one or two big ones with name recognition that could diminish them. So, I mean, as a First Amendment person saying that, that's a tricky kind of argument to make. It's one I think at least worth discussing and considering, whether there are just some groups that are so far outside the bounds. But I think unless we as a country are willing to go there and put them with Al-Qaeda, then if you're allowed to exist, then you're allowed to have speech rights and protest rights, and then we have to figure out how to manage those carefully and constitutionally.
Yeah. So do you think the dividing line, using your Al-Qaeda comparison, might be groups that sponsor terrorism or violence as being perhaps a way to say, this is outside the bounds of protection, but these are, even if it's hateful speech, as long as it remains just speech, if we can say that it's just speech, would you see the dividing line on those bases?
It's really tricky to implement in practice, right? So the historical examples, think about labor unions. In the early 20th century, you had massive, violent labor protests, and then the question is, does that make organized labor a violent terroristic group that you can ban in perpetuity, or do you say that was last year or last week, and we're going to give the group another chance in this instance? And you can go either way, but if you sort of stain the entire group or movement with past acts of violence, then you're suddenly constraining a lot of expressive activity. Yeah. It's a hard question to answer, but it's one we ought to be thinking about, I think.
Yeah, that's good. But you mentioned that just having constitutional legal structures in and of themselves may not be enough. It's a necessary condition, but it's probably not sufficient to bring about the healthy pluralism that you're envisioning. So you talk a little bit about aspirations for the populace, in particular tolerance, patience, and humility. And I know that in conversations with my colleagues and sometimes my students, when we talk about tolerance, there's kind of an impromptu or knee-jerk response by saying, well, tolerance just means that I have to agree with you, right? That really I have to let go of my deep difference or my deep convictions and find some way to agree with your position. Is that what you mean by tolerance? And if not, how would you define it?
Yeah, it's not what I mean, and I think it's an important distinction and one that I have to tackle constantly in my own university setting. The definition of tolerance, particularly in higher education, is one that has morphed into tolerance as full acceptance, right? You are not sufficiently tolerating me unless and until you accept and encourage and embrace everything about me and everything I do. Now, I think, first of all, I think that's a philosophical impossibility for us to manage in real life, but I also don't think it's consistent with how we have originally and for a long time understood tolerance. And so in the book, I try to push toward tolerance, and this is an argument that I think is important for Christians to think about. We're not going to tolerate to the point of acceptance everything, because our lives and our faith are grounded in some pretty particularized claims about the order of the world and the created order and what happens in the eternity of time. And those are pretty big questions about which we have particular claims to make. So we're not going to tolerate all difference, but we can approach, and sometimes even the best we can do is endure that difference. And that means enduring differences that we find painful, or we find challenging, or we find morally problematic. It also means that we have to do, to the extent that we can, the work of distinguishing people from ideas. We have to remember, I need to be able to say to you, I think your ideas are bad, incoherent, immoral, evil, harmful. And maybe I don't say that in the first conversation I have with you, but I also need to remember you're a person created in the image of God, and that, and actually, on the person-to-person level, I'm not just asked to endure you, but I'm asked to see you as a fellow human being.
Yeah. And that comment that you made about maybe we wait till the second conversation reminds me that sometimes, especially in Christian circles, we're so confident in our positions because they're grounded in Scripture, they're grounded in tradition, and they've been, kind of confirmed with millennia of history. How do we exercise humility, even if we are deeply confident about the positions that we hold? Or what's the tension, I guess, between confidence and perhaps overconfidence or arrogance?
Right. Maybe part of it starts with just our social skills and working on those a little bit. I used to be a volunteer Young Life leader, and I think in life, most of what I learned about how to relate with other people, I learned in Young Life, and that includes going into a faculty committee meeting and starting with, what's your name, right? Rather than, here's the order of business, right? And trying to have the get-to-know-you conversations, or just to throw out the silly question in a group setting that is going to let people talk about themselves for a little bit. And I think one of the great memorable phrases from Young Life is that we have to earn the right to be heard. And I think that's right? You don't just step in a missionary context, you don't show up on day one and say, let me tell you about truth, right? You get to know people and earn trust, and that's part of what we as Christians are called to do in this missionary context too.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of my first day here at APU, and I walked into my brand new department. I didn't really know my colleagues, and I declared very confidently that the Dodgers were the best baseball team in America. Yes. And there's good reason for that, of course, because they are empirically the best baseball team in America today. But little did I know at the time that on the other side of my aisle, so to speak, was a Yankees fan. And so we had a great conversation, but I probably didn't win any friends that first day, or at least half the department wasn't my friend.
And here, surveying my context here, I'm not going to talk about Duke's superiority to UCLA. So.
Oh, dangerous territory there. So to get back to our conversation here before we get in trouble, yeah. So we've talked about patience, humility and tolerance. We haven't talked yet about patience. And I guess one of the things that my question would be around this is, how long do we have to be patient, right? I know that Scripture has some things to say about that, but really, how long? Especially when we're talking about injustices and things that we find deeply offensive. In talking with people, I know that they are just tired of having to always be patient, but yet you say we should aspire to that. So how do you see that fitting into the equation?
I think this is a great example of where sometimes I need to distinguish the book I wrote, which is really for anyone of no particular faith commitment, and the message is applied to Christians. So I think for Christians, the ideal of patience is one that's built into our story, right? We know the end of the story. We know that God takes a long time to work sometimes. We know it's not about us, and that part of what we're doing is sometimes just laying the groundwork for generations that are going to come after us. Now, in the moment, sometimes patience requires action, and that's a hard line to distinguish. Even inaction can be a kind of active inaction in a way. So I think of Henry Nouwen, who talks about this important notion of active waiting, right? And how the biblical stories so often are about waiting, but they're not just kind of sitting by and checking out. They're waiting actively and preparing hearts and minds for what's to come in that waiting. So I think we have a ton of resources to draw upon as Christians for what patience looks like. But patience also maybe counsels us that it's not about control, that sometimes patience is waiting outside of the levers of control. I was thinking about this a little bit in our time this morning, and there was one of the worship songs where the line was, I'm blanking on the exact wording, it was something like, set your church on fire, turn this nation back. And it kind of sounded like a non sequitur to me. I'm all about, set your church on fire, that's our prayer, but turn this nation back. Back to what? I mean, back to the 1950s, not a great time for African Americans. back to the 1940s, not a great time for Japanese Americans like my grandparents who were interned not far from here. So there is a sense where I think patience for Christians is not looking to reclaim something, but it's what James Hunter calls faithful presence, right? We're here, we're not going away. Whatever happens, we're called to be present and active with those around us for the sake of God and for the sake of neighbor. And I think that's the game plan. We know it from Scripture, and we need to work on implementing it.
Yeah. So one of the common tactics in the past has been around to use collective action to kind of make our case more forcefully in the public square by getting people together and marshaling our interests. And I know that during the civil rights movement that was a successful tactic. And I know that, as we look across the street and there's Chick-fil-A, that they've been the subject of boycotts and other collective actions in the past because of positions that the CEO has had. What role do you see collective action playing? Is it one that is helpful, or do you think there's some potential danger with that too?
Yeah, this is one of the most theoretically puzzling parts of working out the ideas in this book, this notion of collective action, because on the one hand, we find not only greater meaning in our own lives, but greater ability to speak into public conversations when we do that in groups. The single employee is not likely to get the attention of upper management, but a group of employees coming together can sometimes do that, or the single consumer or the single citizen. So the groups that we form and the ways that we engage collectively have a tremendous amount of good social and political power to them in some cases. On the other hand, when we use that kind of collective action, particularly when we direct it not against the government but against our fellow citizens, this creates a problem and a tension with these aspirations of tolerating and being patient with others, right? Because we're actually using often the levers of economic or social power to say, we want you to change or to shut down, and we're not going to stop until you do that. Now, this gets in the news, I think, often around sort of culture warsy issues, and there, I think I talk about Megan McArdle's observation in the book where she says these culture wars boycotts are totally ineffective. She was talking about this after Hobby Lobby, and she said, the number of people who don't like Hobby Lobby who are also small home crafts people is like zero in my Facebook feed, right? So there's not, to declare war on Disney or Starbucks or Hobby Lobby is just not going to be very effective. There are some cases where forms of collective action and even boycotts do make sense, and I think in the civil rights era we have some great examples of those, but it's a really hard line to figure out, the difference between Claiborne hardware in 1958 and Starbucks today, and where does that line draw? So I think part of maybe the suggestion is, as we think about our forms of collective action, how does that relate to these aspirations of tolerance, humility, and patience? Are we at the point where we have to do this? Are our methods of engagement consistent with this? What's our witness as Christians in doing this? I think there are many times where we have to be collectively engaged, and probably for Christians even more so, right, in making public expressions of not only what we believe, but why we are showing solidarity with other people and the importance of doing that. But we have to be, I think, wise and careful in how we do that.
Yeah. And do you think it's important to maybe be selective, too, on the issues that we're boycotting or marshaling collective action over? I'm thinking was it last year that people were upset with Starbucks because they just went to a plain red cup for their Christmas drinks and didn't have a Christmas slogan. And some people felt very passionate about that. So I guess I'm wondering if it's the boy who cried wolf scenario, where if we complain about too much, then people are going to stop taking it seriously altogether.
Yeah, I mean, pick your issues wisely, right? I mean, if you're going to boycott Starbucks, wait till they take away the midnight mocha or something like that. That's actually going to matter, right? I think it is important to be selective so that we don't become sort of people and institutions that are just the protest people. I also think, though, Christians especially can take more risks in what partnerships look like, and I think we're sometimes not very good at that. Jesus was all about taking risks. I like the messy middle idea, right? That yeah, it is going to be messy, right? And people looked at Jesus and said, "Why are you with those people?" But he still went, right? I have a sort of a recent example of this in my own life. I'm on the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and InterVarsity a couple of years ago at its big missions conference, had a speaker who was a PCA-trained worship pastor who was also involved in Black Lives Matter in St. Louis. And that caused a huge stir and controversy that, how could InterVarsity possibly be partnering with Black Lives Matter? And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post shortly afterward that I titled, I think deliberately, I titled, "Do Black Lives Matter to Evangelicals?" Raising that question, and trying to make the points, right, to say that Black Lives Matter, even to say that you're standing in solidarity with this sort of loosely defined group, some of whose claims are totally antithetical to the gospel and that you're not going to agree with, and some of whose claims are consonant with our claims as Christians, is something that we can do, and we can do that in confidence, and we can name the common ground without thinking or suggesting that we're compromising our faith. But even that argument was a very hard one to make, and I got a lot of feedback from a lot of Christians who were saying, how could you possibly cross that bridge? I think we're going to have to find ways to partner with people who aren't like us, partner with groups some of whose goals and visions aren't ours, but to find those common ground spaces and to come together when it makes sense to do so, and when we're asked to do so for the sake of the witness of the church.
Yeah. So we're about ready to take audience questions, but I'll just leave our time together with this. We know that from social science research that our growing pluralism, our heterogeneous society, means that we have a hard time necessarily finding community. In your mind, is confident pluralism a way to help us build trust with one another? Or how do we, I guess in many ways, how do we bridge the ideological divide with our relationships with one another? And how do we build trust in that regard?
I think building trust is essential, and I think it starts with being honest about what our differences are. Now, that becomes harder the more granular you become, and when you have an institution with a set of commitments around it to be part of, whether it's this place or some other one, you're going to have disagreements, and at some point with those disagreements, you're going to say, this is what it means to be part of us, and this is what it means not to be part of us, and that involves all kinds of challenging issues. But I still think, particularly in the broader society, as we think about what interinstitutional partnership looks like, what ordinary conversations with our neighbors looks like, it means building trust by being able to say and name with particularity what our differences are. And I'm worried that one of the current vibes in university campuses especially is to pretend like we actually agree on lots of things, and we come up with buzzwords and catchphrases and just assume like we're all together about those. And we're not. We need to press in harder to ask, what do we mean by this? What is our institutional identity around this? Why does it matter? And then being willing across institutions to say that we do disagree, and to figure out ways where we can still come together in spite of that.
Yeah, good. Well, I like ending on a come together moment. And I forget now where our people are who have questions. Oh, perfect. So I will turn it over to you, and we'll have some time of Q&A with the audience.
Thank you so much for being here. Our first question is, what are your thoughts on the intersection of pluralism and power? For instance, recognizing that not everyone's viewpoint may be equally represented or applied in practice, what are some ways to offer a wider platform for the representation of voices that may be normally silenced?
Great. I did say before that I'm going to turn all the hard questions to Jennifer, so why don't you take that one? No, I think it's part of what I'm trying to get at when I talk about in the beginning of the book, this idea of a modest unity, is recognizing, one, the descriptive reality that our political conversation has changed in the last, especially 100 years. And one of the reasons it's changed is that we've recognized and included more voices who, prior to now, have not been included. And when you expand the set of voices in a conversation, that puts pressure on coherence and messaging and all kinds of things. It makes it messier, but it makes it, you actually get to hear more from the people around you. So we have to figure out better ways to continue to do that. And I think this is the power question, I think is a nice way to put it, because it is related to the significance of recognizing the need for basic protections before people can even have a conversation. So I've said in a couple settings in St. Louis, it would not make sense for me to go 7 miles away from Wash U and to get out of my car and to look around and say, let's talk about pluralism, right? Because we needed to talk about things like healthcare and schools and safety first. And that's, I think, part of the power dynamic, which then creates massive policy problems to address and talk about. But until we get to the same page, we're not going to, it's actually easiest maybe to talk about pluralism in a place like this, where we've got the luxury and the time to think through ideas and to unpack our differences. It's a lot harder when you're trying to put food on the table, right? And there are probably people here who are just juxtaposing both of those situations today.
The second question has to do with social media. How do we respond or correctly voice dissent to the changing narrative when social media often changes the perspective of what happened and then transforms the conversation to something new or more sensationalized by using new images and voices that may not have been part of the original discourse?
Yeah, I think the answer is get off of social media. but knowing that most of you won't, and knowing that I won't either, I think one of the practical steps I've taken that has really helped me is on Twitter, for example. I just am very deliberate about trying to bring into my Twitter feed very opposing viewpoints. Some of whom are people who drive me crazy in either direction, but I just want to get a sense of how they're responding to and experiencing particular national news events and that sort of thing. And then if I'm ever going to write something that I know is going to be for a public audience, I vet it with people with very differing views, because I realize, it starts with recognizing our own limited capacity to understand reality, particularly as it unfolds in a very rapid sense. So think about let's not think about anything in the last week or month or year, and how quickly you're inundated with information and your emotions start flying and you're wanting to, and sometimes confirm your priors about it, and it's very hard to step out of that and say, what's going on here? Or maybe the truth here is a reflection of our broken world, and that the truth is that two sides of this confrontation or this clash or this incident are actually both with authenticity, seeing it very differently, and there's not going to be a way to say you're right and you're wrong, but there needs to be a bridge conversation that happens. And none of our social media tendencies sort of push and help us in that direction. It's an enormous challenge, and it's not going to get any easier given where the market incentives are in this form of communication.
No, we do have that echo chamber effect that we have to work very hard to try to overcome.
I think it's interesting because in some ways, we've always had the echo chamber, right? We've always had partisan press, going back to the 1800s, who would frame events and people in ways to conform pre-existing norms and to prejudice people against opposing viewpoints. What seems different now is just the onslaught we have of it. So I think when I was growing up, there were maybe 2 occasions a day where I would get hit with the national news. It'd be the morning paper and the evening news with my family. And now think about how many times, I'm always refresh, right? What's the 3-minute update to this event? And there's something very, very, I think, psychologically damaging about that, right? And emotionally exhausting about that. And we're thinking about these things all the time, often slanted with partisan or ideological framings that then, I think, over time compound and reinforce our own agitation about something. And there's reason to be troubled and concerned about lots of things, but I think if we can take the time to step back and reflect a bit, then we'd be better about describing the situation.
Good.
John, our next question has to do with our current generation of students that we have. Why do you think millennials have so much lower regard for First Amendment speech protections than previous generations? What dynamic changed in their viewpoint formation? And what should we as a Christian university be doing to change that outcome for our students?
So I think one thing to mention is that on the Pew polling, it's not like the rest of us are doing all that much better, right? So millennials might be 40% and boomers are 25%, but that's still a staggering number, right? Given where I sort of assume the baseline is with what our First Amendment should be. So this is not simply a millennial problem. I think it's exacerbated in younger generations with some very powerful cultural norms, including cultural norms that become their own echo chambers in a sense and say, this is what is right. We used to be 20 or 30 years ago, Christians were worried about relativism on college and university campuses. That's not the issue anymore, right? People are very, very clear about what truth is. There's just disagreement about how to explain and implement and defend what those claims are. But when rigid claims of truth that are sometimes embodied and sometimes reinforced in certain settings suggest that non-truth can't be heard, that's when we get into First Amendment problems. And of course, historically, Christians haven't always been on the right side of this one either, right? There have been lots of times in our own country and elsewhere in the world where Christians have said, if you're speaking untruth, your voice won't be heard. And maybe the collective lesson learned here is that usually doesn't end well, right? And for Christians especially, I think we say we want to be able to convey truth and show our lives to other people, but we don't want to be coercive about that. It's not the gospel, and it's not very effective either.
So I had a conversation with one of our alumni students who is working now for an assemblywoman, and there was a talk about introducing a bill in California. I know that other states have done this too, that would require university campuses to hold debates on various topics or to prohibit them from banning speakers. And so she floated that idea by me and asked for some feedback. And my initial thought was, mandating free speech. There's something, we're going to coerce free speech. There's something problematic about that concept. But I do think it's trying to tap into this idea that we want to champion free speech. How do we do that in a constructive manner? And yeah, I don't know if you've encountered dialogue like that at your campus.
Yeah, mandating free speech is a very bad idea, I agree, particularly in private institutions.
Yeah.
I do think, though, in higher education, colleges and universities have their own institutional responsibility here, and so I'm often puzzled, yes, I want to absolutely defend the right of a student group or a college or university to bring in whatever speaker they want, however controversial. But there's a threshold question: is why are you bringing some of these people in, right? Why in the world would anyone bring Ann Coulter onto a college campus? I have no idea, right? She's not going to contribute meaningfully to discourse. There are other people who hold substantive views similar to hers who are willing to engage in discourse, right? And so there's not a short list of people who want to speak on campuses about their views. So find someone who's willing to come into, and you could say the same thing on the left too, right? That find a person who's not just going to come in and throw bombs, but someone who is going to, with clarity and without compromise, say what those views are, and then open them up to the norms of the university, which are let's dialogue and debate. And so I think there's an institutional responsibility that a lot of schools haven't really thought through very clearly. And part of that is, even when it's the student group making the invitation, what is the framework and the messaging from the administration that says, a year in advance to that student group, tell us your thought process here, and how can we help work with you to bring in the kind of person who is going to represent your views, but do so in a way that's going to be useful and effective and not just generate a protest.
And not to throw insults and bombs all over campus, right?
Yeah, if we can't work harder to practice our speech patterns with each other in a place like this, what kind of hope do we have for the rest of society, right? We're trained, many of us are here having spent a lot of years listening to differing arguments and learning how to respond with patience and with questions, and if we can't model and do that here, then it's certainly not going to happen on Facebook, right, or at the office water cooler or wherever it is.
Yeah. Our next question is, how do you reconcile strong freedom of speech and assembly with situationist psychology, memetics, and other areas of empirical research that suggest we are very vulnerable to social influence?
I don't know what any of those things are, so I'm going to... There's always a challenge of the forceful rhetoric or the expressive moment or the peer pressure that is going to unhelpfully convince people emotively or non-rationally that they need to join the effort. And at the extremes, it gets really scary, right? It can lead to violence and, I mean, it can lead to genocide, it can lead to all kinds of very, very bad things. But I'm also not sure what the alternative is, because we're always interacting with each other and in our speech. I think we're always operating on multiple levels. And so this notion in political theory, this idea that we could just have reasonable, rational discourse and constrain our communication with each other so we're just thinking logically, I think that's just an impossibility as human beings, right? We're going to be expressive and emotive and hopefully logical, and we're trying to persuade, and sometimes we're trying to, or even if we're not trying to, we do manipulate. And so the reality is this is how we are. We need to think carefully about how that spreads. And this, tying back to the social media question, now more than ever, the emotive responses can spread very quickly and very rapidly, and that's something we need to think about, how to manage, and managing needs to happen before the moment. It has to be in how we prepare for the moment.
Our next question is, how do you suggest Christians engage with LGBTQ in a way that reflects confident pluralism?
Yeah, so this is a big issue on a lot of Christian college campuses today. I think, depending on, on one level, it comes down to a question of institutional line drawing, and institutions are going to draw lines that are going to have implications that follow from those lines. But I think there needs to be places, maybe this ties back to my Black Lives Matter example. There are clear instances in society now, LGBT bullying, for example, that it should be just unambiguous that Christians should be on the side of saying this is a problem, to name the problem, and here's how we need to work to address it. And we own some of that problem too, right? Some of the bullying comes from Christian institutions themselves. And the inability of Christians to say, even to acknowledge the problem, let alone partner to work toward a solution, I find damaging, not just to confident pluralism, but damaging to our witness to our neighbors. And there are other examples too of where this needs to happen more. I think we also need to find ways to work toward friendship, even with, I always love hearing, I shouldn't say this way, there's a narrative that talks about like the activist fill in the blank, right? Those activist people over there, as if there's some organized group of the activists. Well, there are in some places, there actually are organized activists for just about everything. But most people who care about issues aren't sort of the activists collectively, right? They're real people with real lives and real hopes and dreams. And I think we've got to, just as we don't want people talking about the Christians or the white evangelicals or whatever it is, we don't want to be talking about the activists or the undifferentiated community that's no longer people. And once we focus on human beings and relationships, I think we can learn how to at least start by dialoguing better. And the truth of it is, for not just this particular issue, but a lot of issues, a lot of Christians have managed to put themselves in a social bubble where they don't actually have meaningful friendships with fill in the blank, right? And then what follows is a lot of reinforced stereotypes about fill in the blank, and collectively a compounded lack of desire even to work toward friendship. And that's, we've got to figure out a way to change that. I think actually, the people whom you serve here, the students, past, present, and future, are a great resource for being able to do that. And so to think about ways to make that more effective and to encourage that.
We have time maybe for about 2 more questions.
Okay. This question is regarding the role of the church in the public square. You mentioned the legal and civic structures that need to be changed in order to meet the challenges of this historical moment. What role can the church play in this moment that moves us toward a more confident pluralism without giving up our biblical positions? And how do we practice confident pluralism in our churches, which have historically been segregated on the basis of racial, political, and cultural differences? So, for example, What have we learned from Christian minorities from other countries? How have they facilitated a groundswell of public support for religious liberties?
Yeah, it's such a critical question to be thinking about. And I mean, I think one of the ways to respond is to say that I'm going to make some broad generalizations, and if you don't like what I say, you can follow up with other people here later. But I think, generally speaking, a lot of the most public and platformed voices and institutions from evangelicalism in this country are largely and culturally white institutions, and their leaders are largely culturally or actually white, and the money is largely culturally white money. And so part of this, I think, very pragmatically, is figuring out how this generation of Christian leaders and institutions can carefully and deliberately work to shift that and help to platform Christians of color, help to platform institutions that aren't culturally white institutions, but that are committed to the gospel and to evangelicalism's future. For one reason, because the demographics are all telling us that the future of the church in the West is not a white church. And so what does it mean to begin to build for that future now? It's important, but at a very pragmatic level, it means working really hard to diversify your boards and your leadership, and working really hard to make money priorities. Now, this doesn't mean, like, if you're out there and your program happens to be, right, the diversity program, that you should get all the money, right? There are complicated questions about where and how money flows, but money matters, and I think we're not yet having the conversation that's asking the hard questions about the generational wealth that's there for some pretty complicated reasons when we start to unpack why it's there in certain places and not in others, and how as Christians we can move wealth, power, influence, and platforming into a broader set of conversations. And I think, I know, schools like this one are working and thinking hard about how to do that, but the challenges, I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of some of these challenges. And without knowing anything about your internal conversations, knowing that when it comes to questions of race, that Protestants and evangelicals in this country are just scratching the surface, and we need to go a lot deeper, and deeper means a lot more pain, and before reconciliation comes honest and hard conversations. And the question is, are we going to hang in there long enough to do that? And I think it's an open question right now. I have hope as a Christian that we will do that, but it's not going to be easy. But I think it's just an absolutely critical need for the church, for who we're supposed to be, but also for the sake of our witness to the rest of the world.
Okay, last question.
This last question is actually kind of a two-parter, but pluralism carries a meaning that all belief systems are equally valid and equivalent. Is this what you mean, and can you expand on that? And then what suggestions do you have for us as APU faculty to create opportunities for us to engage with other faculty and to also engage with students on this issue? What specific venues would you suggest?
So in the first question, and I'm glad the question was raised, because there is this there are competing definitions of pluralism, and in the philosophical literature, there are arguments for pluralism that lead precisely to a kind of relativism or a blend of pragmatism that just says all truths are out there and they're all equal and good, and difference itself should be celebrated. That's not what I mean by pluralism. One, I don't think that's actually possible, but two, it's not at all compatible with Christian faith. So I was I was having coffee with an atheist philosopher friend, and we were talking about pluralism in the coffee shop because we're kind of boring people, and that's what we do. And he was saying, I love pluralism and difference because I love the fact that you like mint chocolate chip, and I like vanilla, and you like this TV show, and I like that one, and you believe in God, and I don't believe in God. And I said, no. As a Christian, that last one is a totally different kind of difference that I don't celebrate, right? It's not a good thing. That it's not a good fact of the world that you don't believe in God. And so let's start there. And I think that necessarily leads Christians to, if you're going to engage across difference, you can't affirm and celebrate all of that difference as true or good, that we do have claims about the created order and the deity of Christ that make all the difference in the world, and we can't lose those claims. So that's why pluralism can't be relativism. And in making and engaging with pluralism, Christians have to be clear about that, right? And it's going to cost you some potential allies if you actually say, this is actually what I mean by pluralism. So then to the practical question of what you as faculty and staff here can do to facilitate those kinds of conversations and environments, don't overestimate the importance of the really simple things, like venues with a small group of people where you provide food, right? I mean, that food makes a world of difference and opens up, or instead of having the lunchtime meeting where everyone has to leave at 1:01, have it, the dinner conversation where people can linger and realize that many of the best conversations are going to happen in that space afterward, and work to tap into your own networks to figure out who's the really intriguing person who I could bring to this. Sometimes the venue of 600 people is a good idea, but often it's the group of 10. Who's my friend who thinks totally differently about this issue and who's actually going to come in and just shock everyone in the room, but to do so in a way that's going to be productive and useful and generate conversation. So to be creative like that. And then I think for a place like APU, what are the other Christian institutions and people with whom you can be partnering in creative ways? So we often talk about the church, right? So what is the church, and how does the church here come together in really interesting and helpful ways? A friend of mine is just about to publish a book called The Genius of One. Greg Holder, who's a pastor in St. Louis. And one of Greg's points toward the end of the book is that we can often actually find the most interesting, unexplored, and creative spaces when different institutions, different Christian institutions come together and figure out relative strengths and weaknesses, and then just open the space to try something new. And I think we need to be starting to do that more as institutions, whether local institutions or national networks, that we just say, how can we partner with each other more effectively? And that's also, even within the church, that's going to mean a lot of willingness to find common ground while acknowledging deep differences on other issues.
Well, you've been so generous with your time. I don't want to extend it beyond our lunchtime because food is important, as you pointed out. But I wanted to just give you an opportunity to close maybe with a hopeful thought. We're hopeful people as Christians. If you could forecast the future and have a hand in scripting that, what would it look like? And what would you like to leave us with as a vision for the future?
Well, I love that you asked the question with the word hope, because that hope is a theological virtue. We claim hope, and we look at sort of the crystal ball, or we look around us and we look on social media and we think, wow, there's a lot of bad stuff happening, right? Locally, nationally, elsewhere in the world, and we're worried about X, Y, or Z. And I think it's smart to be prudent, and it's smart to have experts think about things carefully and how we can respond best. But we're also fundamentally people of hope, and we know the end of the story. We know what we're called to do, to love God and to love neighbor, and we can do that regardless of the circumstances around us. Now, it could be harder or easier at times. It might be sometimes different access to cultural prestige and can be helpful, and sometimes it can be really harmful. But I think we just have to remind ourselves that we're people of hope, and that we're people who shouldn't be afraid to take risks and to go into that messy middle, right, into those partnerships. And even sometimes the hardest thing to do is when other Christians will start to critique you for taking those risks. And so be patient and dialogue with them to the extent possible too. But to know that, I think for the sake of the church, but also for the sake of the witness of the church to the world, we have to keep telling ourselves that over and over again.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for spending so much time with us, and we're really grateful to have you here. Thanks
for having me. Thanks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Walsh.